the legacy Maryland Venture Fund was it was very Baltimore-centric. And as you know, this great state we all live in, there's a lot of deal activity all over the place. So I wanted to make sure when I rebuilt the team that we had people and presence in particularly the important deal geographies, but I wanted it distributed and become less Baltimore-centric. So back to Parag, he lives in Northern Virginia, and as you know, there's a lot of activity going on in the DC, Montgomery County, Northern Virginia area. That's definitely a bigger hub than Baltimore for venture capital investments. So he was a key hire. Phil, who had worked with Jim Pastoriza at TDF Ventures, he lives in Washington, D.C. He moved from Silicon Valley to D.C. to get his MBA at Georgetown. He worked with Jim. He still lives there today. Artie, she's kind of on the middle of the team in terms of where she lives in the state. She's right there, right near our offices in Columbia, Maryland. We're officed in the Tenable Network Security Building. Myself, I moved up in 1995 when I joined with Frank at Growtech to northern Baltimore County. Growtech was officed in Timonium, Maryland, so I moved up north, and I had my first child in the first year I was working with Growtech, and we never moved. My wife and I raised our kids there, and now they're both in college, so I guess we're free to move again, but that's where we raised our kids. And then Moss, who I said earlier, he lives in Baltimore City. So there's a nice geographic dispersion of the five of us across I'll say the key deal corridors in the state of Maryland. There's a bunch of assets we've inherited when this thing moved over to TEDCO. We call that the Legacy Maryland Venture Fund. And in that bucket of assets, it's about 110 million in asset value. There's three types of assets. There's, as you said, Edwin, there's investments in venture capital funds. There are 9 partnerships we're invested in, and we're invested in some very high quality funds. Growtech, for example, Frank Adams Fund, Flair Capital in Boston. It's a good roster of 9 venture investments. That's one bucket of assets we inherited. There's this second bucket, which I referred to earlier, we inherited 85 direct investments in companies. Okay, whether it was debt investments and or equity investments. The third bucket is cash. There was a lot of cash that came over in this transaction. So combined, you add up all those asset values, it's about 110 million. It's a big responsibility to manage that. That's what we've started with. We have plenty of cash. As I said earlier, we're really gearing up the new investment process. And we're using some of that cash in the legacy pool of capital to invest in new companies. We're also in the process of raising a new fund. We haven't formally closed it yet, but we're going to manage that as we're calling it Fund 1 under the new regime of Maryland Venture Funds. So in a few months' time, we'll have this new fund online, and we'll also have this legacy pool of assets that we manage. What's unique about that legacy pool of assets, it's an evergreen fund. So when we cash out of a successful investment, that capital goes back on the balance sheet. So in theory, that can be an evergreen source of capital to drive new business growth and new investments in the state of Maryland. So that's kind of an overview of what we manage today.